This podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. After experiencing trauma, I went to therapy, and my therapist guided me through a difficult time in my life. They helped me understand what was happening and provided me with tools to cope and find my own strength and resilience. Their experience and compassion were invaluable and enabled me to rebuild my life and move forward. I strongly believe in the power of therapy to help people through difficult times. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who is trained to listen and give you helpful, unbiased advice. First, you go to their site. You can use my link, betterhelp.com/resilience. You answer a few questions, and BetterHelp will match you to a professional who has years of experience helping people with struggles just like yours. Let BetterHelp connect you to a therapist who can support you, all from the comfort of your own home. Visit betterhelp.com/resilience or choose podcast, then Notes on Resilience during sign up and enjoy a special discount on your first month. Hello, and welcome to Notes on Resilience. I'm your host, Manya Chilinsky. My guest today is Dan McMillan. He is the founder and leader of Save Democracy in America, a nonpartisan campaign to get big money out of politics. He has a PhD in German history, and he is the author of How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust. We had a fabulous conversation about resiliency and human rights, and I think you're really going to enjoy this episode. Find Notes on Resilience on Apple Podcasts. Please subscribe, and if you like the show, we'd love for you to leave a review. I'm also looking for feedback. What's working, what's not working, and I've got a Google form for you to fill out. I'm busy planning episodes for 2024, and I want to make sure I'm giving you the content that you really want. Thanks so much, and enjoy this episode. Hey, Dan, I'm so excited you and I are talking today. Thanks for being here.
It's really great to be with you, Manya. Thank you very much.
Before we get into the details about who you are and what you do, I would love to know if you could have any superpower, what would that be?
Persuade my fellow Americans to believe in themselves again. I think more than anything else. That's not a superpower, but I guess it would be an act of great persuasion. I feel that, I now work in politics, and my goal is getting big money out of politics because together with our presidents lying to us about wars, those two things across the last 60 years have robbed us of so much of our say in how we are governed, and the people who run this country no longer have the faith in the American people's capacity for idealism, no longer have the faith in the greatness of the American people that I think we should, because having studied our history, most people who teach American history study only American history. I studied German history, and when you can lay our history alongside that of other countries, although we're not perfect, in fact, I don't even say we're better than anyone because we're flawed human beings, just like everyone else, but we have, thanks to the way our history is developed, I think a unique capacity for idealism that has come through again and again in our history. But right now, I feel that my fellow Americans are beaten down, particularly when it comes to politics. People in politics are utterly cynical about the people. A lot of people feel hopeless and discouraged. And I guess if I could, it's one of the things I try to do when I go out there is to try to just remind us that this is a special country, that we stand for ideals. And part of our conversation today will be about how that's been more true in some periods of our history and others. And in some ways, the crisis of the Second World War and the horrors that it brought on, in Europe and Asia kind of helped clarify for us the kind of people we want to be and the kind of people we're capable of being. And that's part of our resilience and the resilience of human civilization, to kind of close the circle. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, I wish you luck with developing that superpower and really being able to persuade us. I appreciate the effort as well. So tell us a little bit more about who you are and what you do. I know you've written some books and would love to just get an overview of what it is that you do that has you and I talking today about resilience.
Well, there's really sort of two angles to that. One is, my first career, I was an academic historian. My field was 19th and 20th century Germany. I went into that field in part because I want to understand how the Holocaust was possible. And so I, through all my decades of study, had been putting together the pieces of an edifice. Then in 2014, I've written 3 books, but this is the only one that's been published. And it's How Could This Happen? Explaining the Holocaust, which is really the only essay out there for the general public on the causes of the Holocaust that pulls all the different factors together in an overview. And then already at the time that I was writing that, began researching and writing a book about money in politics, because it's really the biggest, I think, reason that the American people have been shut out of a say in their own government is that campaigns are so expensive and candidates listen to the people who donate money for these campaigns. I started working on that 2020. I decided that writing a book was not going to have enough of an impact, and I started Save Democracy in America, my nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization. And I promote voter-owned elections, which is a particular approach to fixing this problem, where basically the government would give every registered voter an allotment of cash to donate to campaigns. And if candidates get their money from us rather than from Big Pharma or Big Oil, they serve us. And, how does this all come together in the way of resilience? I think that the Holocaust was the most shocking, the most thorough assault on the principle that an individual human life has value. It was, in some ways, the moral nadir, the moral lowest point of human history. And it's so impressive to me the way that our civilization has recovered from it, not that there aren't plenty of horrors today and there will be genocide in future, but when I talk about our civilization, I'm talking especially about the world's most advanced societies. Germany was one of our most advanced societies, did this horrifying thing.
Yeah.
And in response to that, both those of us who conquered Germany and the Germans themselves gained a moral clarity that left us all determined to improve, to rise to a higher moral plane, to not let ourselves do anything like this again. And this has made all of our societies, that is, what you think of as the first world societies, I think morally more decent and superior to any human society before. And so this is a wonderful example of how recovering from a trauma, whether individual or civilizational, can leave you stronger.
Wow. So you're bringing a historical perspective to the concept of resiliency. And I really want to dive into that because I find that fascinating. And as we start digging into that, I'm just curious, what do you think about the word resiliency?
It's an enormously resonant concept for me. I think that, we don't have to get into it. I don't want to bore people, but through some very hard things that happened in the life of my family in personal terms, so that I myself have had to be very resilient. Some very sad things that have happened, but I'm just far stronger than I would be if I had not had to bounce back to overcome those experiences. Now, bouncing back and overcoming is not a foregone conclusion. You have to rise to it as you know yourself, as you yourself have learned through your experiences. And I guess I've always been a firm believer in gaining strength through adversity. Two role models for me have been Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Okay. Franklin, without having to fight his way back from the loss of his legs. A lot of people think he might not have had the strength to lead us through the Great Depression and World War II.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And Eleanor, and also the compassion that he had for Americans of all social classes, a kind of compassion that wasn't necessarily typical for people of his privileged background, because he really was aristocracy. And Eleanor, remarkably, you'd never think it from her career, grew up as a very fearful person. And she just decided, I don't know when it was, age 16 or 18, she said, I'm just going to find whatever scares me and go out and do it. So her autobiography. And that is kind of a lot of the trajectory of my life, because I was a very fearful teenager, so I set out to become a rock climber. And, when I was 19, I've climbed El Capitan 3 times, which is the biggest rock wall in North America. It's 3,000 feet high. It took us 4 days. We had to spend the nights on ledges. And that's kind of been, a lot of my life has been about seeking out fear, to grow stronger by overcoming it. And, writing a book about the Holocaust was part of that, because that's, for me, the most terrifying event in history, because it's a direct assault on the value of all our lives.
Yes.
I'm picking you off in about 19 different directions, Mani, and I apologize. That's what happens. I warned you this could happen.
You did warn me this could happen, and I wish we had about 5 hours so I could just follow you in all of those directions.
Maybe we should get back to resiliency of Western civilization and human rights.
Yes, let's do that, because I am also guilty of wanting to go down all of those paths that you just talked about. You talked about a civilization-wide trauma and the Holocaust as something that was that trauma for all of us. And, how have we as a people, as a country, as a world demonstrated resilience in the aftermath of that horrible, horrible event?
There were a couple of things. One that's quite remarkable is that our country already during World War II, looking at both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, were fundamentally racist regimes that used theories of racial superiority to justify and motivate genocidal conduct, especially Germany. And although we were ourselves, in some ways, although we were ourselves horrifyingly racist in the treatment of black people in our southern states, led by President Roosevelt, we came in the way that he and others, the government, explained World War II to the American people, is to say, we're actually fighting a war against racism. And racial prejudice is not the American way. And being an American has nothing to do with race or creed or language or anything else. It's about our democratic ideals. And so, as a description of American society, in the reality of Jim Crow, it may not have been all that accurate, or you could say that in many ways it was inaccurate, grossly, in that horrifying way. That challenge, the need to inspire Americans to fight against these ultimately evil regimes, led us to clarify a sense of national purpose. It also clarified for us something that had been very much part of our identity in many points of our history, but not all, certainly in the Civil War, I think in World War I, too, that were defined by ideals, that one of these ideals, equality of opportunity, individual freedom, government by the people, and that it's part of who we are to be the champions of these ideals, that we have a duty to do so. And so when the war was over, we and the other Allied powers that conquered Germany, we articulated, in the Nuremberg trials, we articulated an entirely new crime, crimes against humanity that had not existed before. There had been genocide throughout history, but genocide became named and described in the UN Convention Against Genocide. It was really only in the Nuremberg trials that a war of aggression became a crime. It was a capital crime in Nuremberg, and also in the trials that we carried out in Tokyo. Whereas up to that point, if a great power decided to invade a smaller power for whatever reason, it was sort of like, well, that is, international law is the law of the jungle. The notion that was immoral and must be illegal, So we sort of, in reaction to these horrors, we said, no, we've got to lay down new rules. We have to become better.
Right.
And also because because our government and the whole country said, look, we're Americans. We fight for freedom. We stand for democracy. That not so subtly, delegitimized the racism of our society. And Black Americans took the opportunity. You would see not large numbers, but marches in front of the White House in D.C. with signs that say segregation is not the American way, it is Hitler's way. And there's no answer to that argument because they were right.
Right.
And the NAACP it was either that or the Congress of Racial Equality, but I'm pretty sure it was the NAACP during World War II, went from 50,000 members to 500,000 members.
Wow.
Yes. And then, of course, also those all the black soldiers, although they were, for the most part, denied the opportunity to prove themselves in combat, except in the Battle of the Bulge and a few other cases. Nonetheless, they contributed mightily to the war effort, as troops.
Absolutely.
And they came home thinking, well, listen, I've fought for freedom overseas. Why can I not have this freedom here at home?
Right.
And so, we date the civil rights movement often to the Montgomery bus boycott of 54, 55, but in a lot of ways the groundwork for it was laid during the war.
Right.
And then the years in which the civil rights movement achieved its greatest victories, the two laws, the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65, so much of to get those two bills past the Southern filibuster in the Senate, which was very difficult, because back then you needed 67 votes for cloture to end the filibuster rather than 60 today. Johnson needed massive white support outside the South.
Yes.
And that white support did not come from any affection that white Northerners or Westerners felt for their black neighbors, because the fact is the prejudice was intense against black people North and South. But both Dr. King and also Kennedy and Johnson said to Americans, look, appealing to national pride, that we stand for these ideals, and segregation is un-American, which it was, and it is, for me. And that argument was incredibly powerful. So I guess that is kind of the pathway, or one of the pathways by which I see the trauma of the Second World War leading to resilience and to our country becoming stronger, and really the whole world becoming stronger, because we became the world's model democracy, the leader of the free world. Yeah. People looked up to us around the world for inspiration. So much of that was made possible in reaction to Nazi Germany and the Empire of Japan and the horrible things they did.
Right. Wow. As you were sharing that piece, I'm very curious. We're talking we're talking the government with a capital G, and we're talking large scale here. How is it possible that on this large scale, the government in the country is fighting for human rights overseas and standing for the good, I'll say, and then not bringing those values back down here on the streets to the individuals living in this country? How is that possible?
Yeah, I guess you're kind of asking in a way, why wasn't the victory of civil rights easier than it was?
Yes, I guess.
Which is a really good point. I think that the thing that you have to remember about slavery and how long it took to overcome that, and you needed a civil war, and then the battle for civil rights, is that the subordination of black Americans in our country wasn't just a prejudice. A prejudice was developed and articulated and given a lot more sort of intellectual window dressing from people in academia and people in the eugenics movement and so on than kind of any other prejudice we had. But it was also a complete social and political and economic system. Yes. And one of the things that's really impressive about the triumphs of the civil rights movement is those two laws really achieved a revolution in the South. They overturned an entire social, political, economic system. They essentially destroyed what had been white Americans and black Americans in the South entire understanding of who they were and where they belonged in the world and their place in the world. It obviously didn't end the oppression of black people. It didn't raise them out of poverty. It didn't put a quick, immediate end to discrimination. But I guess, getting back to the answer to your question of why it's possible, it's amazing. People are able to sustain contradictions in their heads. They're able to believe two things that are utterly contradictory at once if it suits their best interest. And in the case of Southern white people, they were so used to, among other things, psychologically, having the psychological benefit of always feeling there's a huge category of humanity that they're automatically superior to. No matter how low they are in white society. That alone is this massive benefit to them. Yeah. So in some ways, the fact that those two laws were able to overturn it and that there wasn't a lot more bloodshed in the South in the 60s is, to me, in some ways impressive. There were probably about 50 civil rights workers who were murdered in the 50s and 60s. That's a figure that I've often been told. I don't know an exact tally. Nonetheless, when you consider how drastic the change was, I guess for me as an historian looking at other revolutions in history, this strikes me as relatively bloodless. And I guess I could say, testimony to our country's capacity for resilience.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. You know, as I think about the concept of human rights and civil rights, and, you know, as a country, this is something we seem to want to export. I'm curious, you know, the role of our government or our institutions or our systems, quote unquote, in supporting us as Americans, as individuals, in recovering from traumas and in building our resilience. Do you feel like that is actually happening, and, you know, why or why not?
Meaning sort of, can our government do more to help people recover from personal trauma?
Mm-hmm.
Manya, I think I may need to stay away from that just because my campaign to get money out of politics is strictly nonpartisan.
Understood.
And the question of the proper role of government in society and how much government should be spending on, that would be qualified as social welfare spending. So if I see something one way or another on that, that kind of gets at cross purposes with my current project. And I really have to be careful because the country's so polarized, and getting money out of politics is something that we can all get on board with. So I stick to that. I said in another interview, actually, I won't take a stand for motherhood. And it's just about that extreme. It's a great question, Manya. It's a great question.
Understood. Well, how about this? Through your work as a historian and your work now, and, you know, we've been talking about human rights and civil rights. What is an important lesson about resilience that you have learned through this work that you've been doing?
I think that's interesting. I'm very close to being able to articulate it. It's on the tip of my tongue now. I mean, it's such a great question, that you're asking, both in personal terms and as an historian looking at the resilience of cultures, of societies. That is just the enormous value of believing in human goodness, in human capacity for goodness, in believing in yourself, in believing in the better angels of your nature. I think that as a general proposition, when you appeal to the good in people, when you show them that you expect them to do the right thing, as opposed to expecting them to, well, if you show people that you expect them to behave badly, that's what you're going to get. I mean, we all have good and bad potential. But it's amazing when you show people that you expect the good in them, then it comes out. I think what is also, I guess, in personal terms, one of the things that saddens me so much is I feel like most people I meet don't feel as good about themselves as they deserve to. And when I look so much at political commentary, and also when I hear people talk about the Holocaust, because the Holocaust is so horrifying, people take it as an opportunity to justify pessimism about the human future.
Yeah.
And I understand that, because it is horrifying. But on the other hand, it's not the only thing we've ever done in history. We've done a lot of other things that could be better. And I guess here's something that I think is useful for resilience, that both for personal and for a society, because our capacity for resilience, I think, is going to be tested rather mightily in the coming decades for all kinds of reasons. The environmental problems, the world being so overpopulated, and for other reasons as well. I think that, people talk about the lessons of history.
Yes.
And the more confidently someone starts talking about the lessons of history, often the less history they seem to have studied, because there are not that many generally applicable lessons. But I'll tell you, there's two that after 4 decades of studying history, both inside and outside the academy, that strike me as indisputable, Manya. One is that it is an ineradicable element of human nature to desire freedom, to determine your own fate, to not live by the arbitrary will of others, to not be pushed around, to not be dominated, to want to develop your own potential as you see fit, to make your own choices. And for that reason, I feel very strongly that every autocratic form of government in history is going to fail. I mean, I feel frankly that capitalism works and nothing else does. People want, you can talk about, there are all kinds of arguments about how best to regulate a capitalist economy, or how high should taxes be, or how low, and how much should the government do, or how little. But fundamentally, the idea of not having the government plan the economy and having business be in private hands, there are a lot of reasons why that's the only way to go. And one of them is just this human desire for freedom. Likewise, The rulers of China right now, Xi Jinping, they seem to think that their form of government is the wave of the future, and they are going to be sorely disappointed. I'm not saying that they're not dangerous or that we must not be vigilant, because we must, against military aggression and all kinds of other kinds of aggression politically from them. But on the other hand, when I hear people in our country, leaders talking about, oh my gosh, we're in this struggle between autocracy and democracy, I feel like sometimes I think it's very essential to be on our guard. We've actually underrated the threat from China substantially in recent years. Now we're kind of coming to see it more clearly. On the other hand, let's approach this contest with confidence. Let's not overreact at this or that minor setback, because long run, there is no contest. Democracy is the only thing that works. Nothing else does. Okay. For all kinds of reasons, but one reason is this essential human desire for freedom. And the other thing I feel I've seen from human history, it is essential to our nature to want to improve. Yes. And that's why we're resilient, because we want to become stronger and better and higher, and not just materially, we don't just want nicer clothes or housing or material wealth, although we do aspire to progress and we aspire to getting better at our jobs and so on, or learning things in science. But we have always aspired to be better human beings, to be morally better and higher. And the belief in human perfectibility, moral perfectibility, is at the root of, at least to some degree, I think, in all of the world's great religious traditions. And just over the last 3 centuries of human history, when I look at our country or all of our friends and cousins in Europe, our allies in Europe and Asia, the moral progress we've made, how much more, even just in the last 60 years in this country. And when you think about 60 years ago, like a woman wanting to have the kind of career you're having now, and if a woman coming out of high school in 1960, the year I was born, who went around saying that she expected to run for president, it would have gotten her a one-way ticket to a psych ward, just to give one example. Or do I think that Black Americans have a level playing field today? I don't. I think the injustice is still enormous. On the other hand, 60 years ago, white-owned businesses in our country had one of 2 policies about hiring Black people. One is just we don't hire Black people. The other is we'll hire Black people as janitors or in menial roles, Right. So, and our founding fathers, a lot of them thought that owning slaves was morally acceptable. And those were great men and good men by the standards of any time. But all by way of saying, I think this desire for progress is just a constant. Often progress is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Sometimes it's 1 step forward and 30 steps back.
Yes.
But those are, I guess, my thoughts about human resilience, about that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. And there's some hope in there. I like the sound of that. So what's one question you wish I had asked you, and how would you answer it?
Wow, Manya, you are an exceptionally creative interviewer, which is partly a euphemism for tough, but that's good. That's good. What question do I wish you'd asked me? Well, I guess you could have asked me specifically about the resilience of Germany. Okay. And if I have a moment, I could just tell you a little bit about that. Please do. I'd like to hear that. Yeah. One of the things, for the first 35 or so years after the war, they were just sort of engaged in determined amnesia about the Nazi era, the crimes, the Holocaust. Most Germans didn't even know what the Holocaust had been until the end of the 1970s. But since then, and I think that it's been said, and there was some writing done on this recently. There was some good work actually about their first prime minister, Konrad Adenauer, and this was deliberate on his part. It was kind of the country has just undergone such trauma. We really just can't deal with this now. We got to rebuild. We'll deal with this later. But eventually they did. And they really, when it comes to a people squarely and bravely facing the dark side of their history, the Germans are kind of the gold standard. And they teach all of this in the schools. They have museums everywhere. They have this kind of memorial called stumbling stones all over Germany. They built into sidewalks. They're little bronze plaques that stick a little bit out of the sidewalk so that you might clip it with your foot. Not enough to trip you, hopefully. And it tells you at this address lived, and they give the names like a Jewish couple. And they were deported to Auschwitz and murdered on October 7th, 1943.
Wow.
So that you're constantly reminded of it. And I think that perhaps partly in consequence of that in Germany, the democratic form of government is valued and revered in a way that I think it is almost nowhere else, except I think it still is here among the American people, although I don't think that it's revered among the people who are running our country. But I think among the American people, it's kind of in our blood in a way that it is in no one else's. But outside of this country, and in particular, you consider that the Germany today in 1990, they had to incorporate 17 million people from former East Germany who they and their ancestors had known nothing but dictatorship for 4 generations going back.
Right.
I think West Germany was like 65 million or 63 million. East Germany was 17 million. And yes, they do have a radical right-wing party, and it's stronger in the former East. But the fact is that even with that challenge, incorporating all these people who, had so little experience with the democratic form of government, I think Germany may well be the strongest democracy on earth, the most stable.
Wow.
So if you want another example of humanity's capacity for progress and resilience, that's a good one.
That is a good example. Thank you for sharing, because I'm not sure that we all know that detailed amount of information about Germany. So thank you for that. And Dan, I could talk to you for about 5 more hours, but
likewise. But you need to have me back, Nanya. That'd be great.
promised my listeners that the podcast is going to stay within about a half an hour time frame. So I'm going to have to say goodbye. But before we do that, how can our listeners reach you?
So the best way, I guess, is to, I would say, go to my political website, which is savedemocracyinamerica.org.
Okay.
And that will tell you about my current undertaking. And there's also a general email address that one can use to contact me.
Wonderful. I'll put a link to all of that in the show notes so people can get in touch with you. And Dan, thank you so much. This is great. I can't wait to finish your book and maybe talk with you again soon.
I would like that very much, Manya. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for listening. I hope you got as much out of this conversation as I did. So if you'd like to learn more about me, Manya Chilinsky, I work with organizations to help understand how to create environments where people can thrive after difficult life experiences. And I do this through talks and consulting. I'm a survivor of mass violence, and I use my experience to help leaders learn about resiliency, compassion, and trauma-sensitive leadership, to build strategies to enable teams to thrive and be engaged amidst difficulty and turmoil. If this is something you want to learn more about, visit my website, www.manyachilinsky.com, or email me at manya@manyachilinsky, or stop by my social media on LinkedIn and Twitter. Thanks so much.